The webinar is now broadcasting, so hopefully.
Yeah, I can.
Oh yeah, participant numbers are climbing.
Yeah.
Good. Thank goodness for Facebook.
And they can hear me saying these things. Hello, everyone.
So welcome everyone. We thank you for investing your Tuesday evening with us. We're going to invite you to please go to menti.com, that's MENTI.com, and enter code 783376. That's codes 7833 and 76. So welcome, thank you for joining us. As a reminder, you'll be able to ask questions of the panelists using the question and answer feature located at the bottom of your Zoom webinar screen. So if you've not located that, look to the right bottom portion of your screen and you should see that, and it says, ask a panelist a question. And so you can choose to keep those questions private. They will be only coming to the moderator this evening, which is myself and the panelists. So good evening, beautiful people. Welcome to Colorism and Race in the Latino, Latina, and Latinx community. Tonight, we're having a conversation with our esteemed panelists. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. As a reminder, you will be able to ask questions of the panelists using the question and answer feature located at the bottom of your Zoom webinar screen. We're asking everyone to please go to menti.com, enter code 783376. Thank you, Michael. It is 783376. And I say, see, yep, thank you. Lisette answered you. Beautiful. Good evening. Thank you to those who are wishing us all a good evening from Buffalo, New York. Hello, Rochester. We see you. Hola from Brooklyn. Yes. Okay. Can you tell I'm a Brooklyn girl? Okay. So excited. From Philadelphia and Los Angeles. Yes. East Coast to West Coast. We are so excited to be here this evening. Columbus, Ohio, welcome. If you have a question for us and your hand is raised, please feel free to put it in the chat, the Q&A, because the only folks who will be able to see your question this evening are the panelists. And I see that Michelle also put the Menti code into the chat box. So once again, that's 783376. And once we get the go-ahead, we will start once Dr. Tamara gives us the go-ahead.
I say we go ahead.
Okay. I'm going to pass it along to you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Tamara Arsace, and I am a board member and co-founder of the Hispanic Heritage Council of Western New York. We are an organization that's dedicated to preserving our history for future generations. I'm also a retired bilingual teacher and director of the multilingual department from the Buffalo Schools. I'm thrilled to welcome you all tonight. I'd like to start off with some quotes. There's a myth in the Latino community that we are this rainbow, multicolored ethnic group. that there's no racism in Latino communities because we're all mixed. It's not true. There's a lot of discrimination in many different ways. These are the words of Guesnerth Josue Perea of the Afro-Latino, Afro-Latina Forum. And in 2019, there was a study by the Pew Research Center that found that Hispanics with darker skin experienced more racism than those with lighter skin. Are you surprised? Juliana Horowitz, a co-author of the study, said, "The idea of colorism is something academics talk about, but it hasn't really been part of the public debate about racial discrimination in the US." And Christina Gomez, a sociologist at the Art Institute of Chicago, says that addressing colorism begins with more open conversation about the problem. For a long time, I've wanted to have a conversation such as the one we're hosting here tonight. As a US-born Latina with parents from the Dominican Republic and grandparents from Cuba, Puerto Rico, Martinique, and DR, I'm part of a family with a wide range of skin tones. My darker skinned brother, who sported an afro in college, was called the N-word more than once. While I know that I myself benefited from unearned privilege and was white passing in many situations throughout my life. While my DNA shows that I'm at least 20% African, and through genealogical research, I've been able to find the manumission documents for some of my enslaved ancestors, I have others who intermarried to maintain the illusion of their whiteness. I don't identify as white, but neither do I identify as Black. Does the one-drop rule still apply in the US? Am I Black? What am I? While I'm proud of my mixed heritage, I feel it would be disingenuous to fully claim my Blackness, as I have not experienced the same discrimination that my darker hermanos y hermanas have endured. We at the Hispanic Heritage Council believe that it is through open dialogue such as this one that we will be able to honor our own Latin American roots and join hands with others to truly acknowledge that Black Lives Matter, and together we can combat racism in all its forms. Thank you for joining us in this critical conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Tamara. And now I'm just going to take a moment and say thank you to our sponsors. So as you all know, that this event is sponsored by the Hispanic Heritage Council of Western New York. We are so excited and grateful that this event is free. As a nonprofit organization, we do welcome donations at www.hispanicheritage.org. And we have included the link in the webinar chat. So you should be receiving that right now. So we thank everyone for donating to this nonprofit. And so I'd like to continue by saying thank you to our sponsors, which include Geico, Buffalo, New York's People Inc., which is a nonprofit human services agency serving Western New York and Rochester, Roswell Park, which is, of course, a comprehensive cancer center. I want to take the time to personally thank every essential worker who's ensuring the health and safety of cancer patients in this time, especially as we're living between these two pandemics, COVID-19 and racial injustice. We know that the work never stops. Last but not least, thank you to the Seneca Nation's Native Pride Travel Plaza, which is celebrating 25 years. We wish you a hearty congratulations. My name is Martha Saint-Jean. I'm going to briefly introduce myself. I'm the founder and CEO of the Equity Project based in Brooklyn, New York. And one of our founding principles is based on the work of James Baldwin, who said, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced." And so we want to talk this evening, as Dr. Tamara said, about colorism. In the 1980s, Alice Walker coined the term colorism. She defined a phenomenon that was taking place in communities for a very long time. Just because there was not a word for it does not mean it did not exist. And in Walker's book, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, she wrote that it is prejudicial or preferential treatment of same race people based solely on their color. So I'm going to state that again, how she defined colorism. It is prejudicial or preferential treatment of same race-based people based solely, on their color. And researchers Dixon and Teles tell us that colorism has since expanded to refer to color-based discrimination regardless of race, and they wrote that in 2017. And I just want to set the stage here of what we're facing this evening in this conversation. Colorism, we want to be very clear, it's a form of discrimination based on skin color. But the word is not synonymous with racism. We often equate race with skin color, but we want to be clear that those two are not always equal. They're not equal ideas. We want to provide you an example this evening. We have what are called hierarchies of color. That is what colorism is really about. And a prominent example in the news, a prominent example in research is of the 2010 census. So 76% of Puerto Ricans identified themselves as white, while 46% have African heritage. So why is there this inherent need to claim whiteness? And I really appreciate how Time magazine put it. It's when, quote, skin color becomes a loaded signifier of identity and value. So why is your value tied to the identity of what color you show up in a space? So this evening, what we're addressing is an issue that's not limited to the Latinx community, but one found all over the world. Many of the roots are as a result of slavery, consequence of colonization, and of course, continued systemic oppression. Colorism is often defined by European beauty standards. Why is that the normal? Why is that the standard? Why is that the convention? And so this evening, the esteemed panelists, I'm so glad that they're here and they've agreed to this conversation. We're gonna have a very open and tough conversation. We're all here because we do not wanna minimize the ideas around racial and skin color discrimination that often results in socioeconomic stratification. So we are here to talk about discrimination. We are here to undo learned prejudices. And we're here to talk about why is light skin often considered body capital, as one researcher put it. And so as we continue, I'm inviting the panelists, starting with Ms. Eunice Lewin, to please introduce themselves.
Hola, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Eunice Lewin. I was born in Cuba in a very small town, Guantanamo. I'm delighted to be here. I am a retired social worker from the Buffalo Public School. Education and public service is my passion. I am delighted to be part of this conversation, which is very, very timely. Thank you, Tammy, for your vision in putting this panel together. And the next, I move it on to Dr. Colon.
Hi, everybody. I'm so happy that we have 90 participants. I'm just so excited to be a part of this much needed conversation. I'm a Buffalo native, born and raised, Buffalo gal, Bills, Bengal all the way. But my heart does live in Puerto Rico, where my family is from. And so colorism is a conversation that I often engage my teacher candidates with. I'm an assistant professor at Buffalo State College. And I also have the distinct pleasure of coordinating the bilingual certificate program. So conversations of colorism, identity, and how all of those markers intersect is really at the heart of what I do. And so I'm so excited to enter into this conversation with you all this evening. Thank you. And so I would love to introduce my esteemed colleague, Michelle Agosto.
Thank you, Glisette. So I'm also excited and very happy to be part of this panel. I want to thank my colleague and friend Tammy for inviting me to be part of this. I also work alongside her with the Hispanic Heritage Council, and Martha for joining in and doing this for us. I'm the Director of Arts for the Buffalo Public Schools, and arts has always been really important to my identity and supporting the visions that I've had being a Latina woman. I'm from Washington Heights, New York, so I saw someone ring up Washington Heights up there, so what's up? And my parents are Puerto Rican, so I come from a very proud family of Puerto Rican people. The women in my family are very proud and strong, and they are my inspiration every day. And I think some of them are watching too. In fact, I know they are. And so I'm just really happy to be part of this conversation. It's an important conversation. We need to have it, and we just need to have it full force. It's that time. And I'd like to pass the baton down to my friend and colleague, Oswaldo.
Oswaldo, you're muted.
There is always going to be one person that's going to do that first, and that was me. So we got that out of the way. We're good. My name is Oswaldo Mestre. Thank you passing that over to me, Michelle. I'm pleased to be a part of this panel. As you can see, something that is so very obvious is that I am surrounded by strong Latina women. I'm used to that. I have 4 sisters and a mom. Born and raised in El Barrio in Spanish Harlem. Let's give that up. Went to school and high school in Brooklyn at Brooklyn Tech, and found my way to University of Buffalo. And so where I work for the city of Buffalo, for the mayor, the 2nd largest city in the state, I am the city's chief service officer and director of citizen services. I also am the president of the Bell Center, the largest Latino community-based organization, human service agency in the city of Buffalo. And so very proud. What a timely conversation to have when we're talking about the issue of colorism. My father is from Puerto Rico, grew up, my grandmother from Loíza, and spent many summers and years in a town called Trujillo Alto in San Just. And so I am very, very proud to be a part of this panel. Thank you. And I'm going to pass it over to my good friend and the person who brought us all here together, Dr. Alasi.
Dr. Alsalce, you are muted.
Of course, I followed Oswaldo's lead. I already introduced myself, and so I'm going to pass it right on to Martha Sanjan, our wonderful moderator.
Just thank you so much for you all having me. Dr. Tamara, thank you for inviting me here to share this space with your wonderful colleagues, your wonderful friends. Thank you all for welcoming me so wholeheartedly into this space. And so, folks, do not let the smile fool you. We are going to have a tough conversation tonight, and we're going to get started with a very simple question. Don't worry, it's not too tough to start off. We'll get tougher as we go along. But we want to start off with a very serious question, and it's a question about our community. In what ways are we experiencing colorism in our community? So what role is colorism currently playing in the Latinx community? And what do I mean by that? Allow me, please give me the time to elaborate. For example, what are some language patterns you notice? What are some refrains? And when I say refrains, things you hear over and over being used by members of the Latinx community. What are opportunities? Is there social stratification that's occurring as a result of colorism? And so that question is open to any member of the panel.
I'll start. I think that it plays out in our community in so many ways, you know, in the language that we use and the way that we refer to people by their hair type. For example, in Spanish, we say pelo bueno or pelo malo, good hair or bad hair. And of course, good hair is the European standard, and bad hair is considered kinky hair. They use terms like mejora la raza, which means to marry someone lighter to improve the race. Throughout our lives, we hear just little micro manifestations of this idea that light skin, smooth hair, thin lips are better than the other. And it plays out in our community in so many ways as well. I mean, we see children watch Latin American television and see that all of the reporters are mostly light-skinned people. The actors and actresses that they see in movies made in America are light-skinned people generally. And they're the models that are held up to represent us in the places of power.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in on that too, that whole idea of mejorar la raza always was a statement that stood out. How do you better your race, and that always meant, white, right? It just meant white. And the idea of marrying into whiteness, which I think has a lot to do with the idea of marrying into some sort of social and economic control, right? That if you can get wider, you can get higher up that ladder, right? And so I think that's something that I've heard about, and it's interesting because I think about my youth, with my family, and though you may have heard things here and there, I don't think I ever felt the impact of that until I got older. It just kind of was part of the language that we lived, right? It was just part of who we were and what we thought would allow us to get ahead. And so so it's just interesting to now have a better understanding of, the whiteness equals this ideal American life, and how do we fit into that, right?
I just wanted to add something to that on the other side. Sometimes we do this to ourselves as a community, negrita, or nene negro, and from my side, or even growing up, where you tell people where you're from and you say, oh, say my grandmother grew up in Louisa, automatically they look at you because they know the people who will come from there are darker skin, and they start to look at you a little bit different. And so these words that sometimes we do to ourselves, and then how we live in terms of stigma, or even how we look at each other, right? You have to choose. My mother is Black and my father's Puerto Rican, and they say, well, which one are you? What do you have to do? And then you have to make the distinction between one of them because somebody's telling you to do that, as opposed to that if you grew up in the area that I grew up, most people look like me. You go up in Spanish Harlem, you go up in El Barrio, or you go up in Washington Heights, they look like me, right? But sometimes when we go to, whether it be in higher education, we all have been to college and or the workplace, folks will have you say, well, what are you? And I think sometimes having to use the burden of answering that question, and I want to be like, well, who are you? Because I know who I am, so I think that's a general conversation to have.
I like to go back to what Oswaldo said about we do it to ourselves. As I said during my introduction, I grew up in Cuba, and there's a word that is used often, and it's negrito, negrita. Oye, negrita, ¿cómo tú estás? Oye, negrito, ¿cómo tú estás? I always wonder who came up with that. Did we do that to ourselves? And oftentimes people reject that because the color Black, the color negro is not seen in a positive way. So I think that by us rejecting it and not rejecting it is really a problem, because then we are accepting white as what is good. So I think that the whole issue as to how people refer to us as people of color can be very negative, if you will.
I just want to chime in, and I agree with everything that my colleagues have said. And I think that we also have to address the issue of implicit bias that exists in our communities. And so I know, Martha, you said that colorism doesn't necessarily equate to racism, but I think that we do have to recognize that that could be the case, and that colorism does lead to disparities and inequalities. We see this play out in our schools, for example. We know, many of us in the room are educators, and we know that there's a disproportionate representation of Black and brown boys, for example, who are harshly disciplined or referred for evaluation of services. But let's dig a little deeper. Studies have shown that students of color with lighter skin are perceived and treated more favorably. And so that implicit or explicit bias at times exists even within our own community. And unfortunately, these biases are held by the educators, the ones who are in the positions of power that impact our students. And we're not just talking about African-American students, we're talking about our Black and brown refugee and immigrant students, we're talking about our Afro-Latinos. And so the colorism displayed by our educators within our community that stem from implicit bias about people with darker skin, as Oswaldo mentioned, you hear Loíza, and we all know in a community that for the most part, Puerto Ricans from Loíza are dark skinned. And so there's this reaction. That's bias there. And consequently, the effects are damaging for our children.
But can I just jump in here for a minute? Because it is just not in the United States, but what is acceptable as good? Tammy talked about good here, kinky here. What is acceptable as good is white.
Yes.
And what comes with white? It comes straight here, comes opportunities. So when I think about colorism, the lighter you are, the closer it gets to what is good.
And that denotes power. And so, and how we relate to that, right? And then even when we're talking about, even in times where we're talking about right now, and how we're relating with law enforcement, how we're relating with that. And so how I see myself, you know, as a person of color, even I'm saying that, right? Because I want to put myself in the category, or we put ourselves in the category. So I agree with what Eunice is saying in terms of what we see as white and Black. And I think, when we talk about colorism and the different intersectionalities with racism, is almost if you hit twice, right? You know, and it's almost like I'm already dealing with this certain kind of way. And now I'm just like, what's going on here? You know, and that's real, especially in times right now where we're taught, and I know we're going to talk a little bit about this in terms of self-care and what do we do about this? You know, so I 100% agree, you know, with my panelists here.
So I want to pick up on a couple of things that I'm hearing the panelists saying. And I'm going to go back to what Lisette said earlier about whiteness and what's happening with our students. I'm also a New York City special educator. So I completely understand the marginalization, the criminalization of our Black and brown students. We need to acknowledge that. We need to acknowledge what's happened with mass incarceration. For those of you who've read Ibram Kendi's book, he speaks about it also, about the 1980s and 1990s, the mass incarceration. And there was even a quote, and there's a saying, and I'm going to go back to it. It says, the lighter the skin, the lighter the sentence. So that's something we even see playing out in that institution. We also see the disparities and the inequalities, the implicit biases based on the color spectrum. So I heard Oswaldo saying, being made to choose. And why are some people, and even in the beginning I mentioned, why are some Puerto Ricans choosing whiteness over brown or being considered Black, even if they have that Afro-Latino heritage? It's because of what Lisette, Eunice, Oswaldo, Michelle, what all of you, Dr. Tamara, are bringing up. There is this idea of equating Black with bad. So the closer that I get to white, the proximity to my whiteness means I have more access to opportunity, power, and privilege. And so if I can identify with that opportunity, that power, and that privilege, I will be able to overcome this so-called racial hierarchy and move within the social stratosphere. So I'd love to ask the panelists, how has it played out in your professional lives? How has colorism played out for you? Have you found yourselves in situations where you have been forced maybe to choose to be on one end of a spectrum rather than another?
If I can chime in, you know, I thought about this question a lot as I was preparing for the panel. And, you know, for me personally, this notion of colorism has really impacted how I identify personally, right? I grew up in a predominantly white family. And when I say white, I'm talking about Puerto Ricans whose genetic makeup favored our Spanish ancestors. And so I was always the odd girl out. I was la negrita con las bembas grandes y el pelo malo, right? And people would always ask me, you know, what are you? Speaking to Osvaldo's comment, and asked if I was mixed because I looked half Black and half white. And it really wasn't until I became a young adult and learned about our histories, right? Being of Taino Indians and Spanish conquistadores and our African kings and queens that are our ancestors, that I realized that I was indeed mixed. I was a mulata or mulatto, right? My mother being a very light-skinned woman from Ceiba, Puerto Rico, with her pelo lacio, fair skin, and my father with his larger than life afro, you know, and darker skinned, I realized, yes, I was indeed mixed. And so, but understanding that my facial features, while I have very light skin, and I recognize that that privileges me, my fair skin and my light eyes, I also understand that my hair and my facial features tell a very different story. And so there's always been that internal and external conflict of being too white in certain circles and not being white enough in other circles. And that's how I see it playing out in my professional world. But really it's having these conversations with our children on how intersectionality impacts our identity, and making sure that our students, our Black and brown students specifically, embrace all that who they are.
Martha, that is, if I may jump in here, that's a very interesting question about colorism and my experience, because for some people I look Black until I speak. And when I speak, and they hear my accent, they say, oh, well, you are not Black, what are you? And I said, well, you know, I'm from Cuba, I'm Hispanic. So I'm torn into the color of my skin. I look at me and say, you are Black. Then when I speak, I'm Hispanic, and that there is not that understanding that you can be Hispanic and also Black. Like Martha said, Black features. So I think that there's a lot of work to be done in terms of educating who we are as people. I'm not Black enough, but I'm not Hispanic enough. And that itself brings prejudices, if you will. So I think that we, as an ethnic group, need to do a lot of work to really understand our history, understand where we are coming from, and the work that we need to do to really help, especially in the school district, in the curriculum, who we are.
Thank you so much for bringing up that idea of the bifurcation that is existing between our identities, about how people force us to segregate and separate who we are as if they are pieces of ourselves and not part of the whole. And so I really want to acknowledge what our panelist Eunice Lewin just said. Why do I really have to choose to be one without the other? So that exclusion of your identification as a Latina to your identification as Afro-Latina to your identification as someone who was born on an island and you happen to speak a certain language. So really all of these are coalescing together and forming your identity. And so I really want to acknowledge this wonderful point you've made, that it is something that all of us here need to further deconstruct. Why are we not allowing for intersectionality?
Martha, I'd like to comment on a couple of things that came up earlier. Your question about Puerto Ricans and identifying as white. In Juan Gonzalez, in his book, Harvest of Empire, talks about the fact that while in the US, there's that one drop rule that I mentioned, in Puerto Rico, there's a different one drop rule, that if you're one drop white, you can identify as white, and that is seen as desirable. I was often told throughout my life that I don't look Dominican. And I would ask, well, what does Dominican look like? And, you know, people thought that Dominican looked darker, and I couldn't possibly be Dominican if I looked lighter. So in my professional life, I've noticed that in our district, at least, Latinos were generally who were achieving levels of administration, for instance, or upper echelons of the district do tend to have lighter skin. They're not dark-skinned Latinos. There aren't even that many dark-skinned Latino or Latina teachers in our district. And so it's one of those things that I think that we need to continue to work towards. And I think it stems from, it really starts from a very young time when, as Glisette talked about, how we differentiate students based on their skin color. So the opportunities that they have for learning, the opportunities they have for achieving high levels are not always available to all students in equal measure.
I wanted to add, so this is in, I have a brown bag, but even in the Black community, they use this and how you want to look at each other. So it's nothing new when we're talking about this in the Latino community. It's something that has been real when we're talking about this issue of colorism, right? And as it affects us, but even how it's reinforced. You know, I work in public service, and right now, we want people to do the census, but look at the questions that they ask, right? If you go down and they ask you, and you're Hispanic, or you're Latino, they ask you, are you white or are you Black, right? And then later on, what country? Or even as we're educating our kids, heard an instance where the teacher was asking a young Puerto Rican kid, young lady, what country are you from? You know, and she was like, what are you talking about? What country am I from? You know, and the mother had to stop because she was listening, and she had to debate whether she was going to stop the class and interrupt, but she had to redirect. So systems reinforce this, systems that we allow to reinforce. You know, again, that census and that question, even time we fill out a questionnaire, you know, and so it's not enough to just to say, you know what, I'm Black, right? Now I have to break that down even further, a little more, you know, so again, how things are just reinforced, you know, is just really, really, you know, it's I'm gonna be honest, it's damning, you know, and especially, and as we learn how to, you know, learn how to do the self-love to each other, right? You know, because if we don't understand, and I think Eunice talked a little bit about this history of ours, this very rich history of ours, and understanding that. I use the example because I would be very proud to say that my grandmother was from Louisa, right? Because that's all I knew, right? Until I got to college, until I started whatever, and I started to see people, you know, people look at you some kind of way, right? People are like, so what was that look about, right? What was that look, you know? And I understood. But, you know, sometimes this issue of color, we're like the last people to find that out because it's reinforcing us to love each other. And we're like, wait a second, again, you want me to choose? What do you know? And so I think that does something to us sometimes too, that we should acknowledge, right? You know, we should.
You know, I just want to jump in on the whole idea of categorization and the whole census issue and the boxes that confine us, again, because of economic and social controls that are set by the government of wherever, right? And so, you know, but it is, you know, up to us though, I think, to make that known and fight that even at the smallest level. So for example, when I came into a suburb of Buffalo, there aren't that many Latinos in this particular district. And the list, I was given a form to fill out, similar, right? The checklist. And they just had like white, Black, I think Native American, and other. And so I looked at that, and you can only pick one. You can only pick one box. And my children are multiracial. I have 2 boys. And they're all sorts of different. And I went up to the counter and I said, I'm not going to fill this out. This does not identify me or my children. And if you need this, then you need to change this. I was so annoyed by that form, you know, and I didn't understand it. I'm not from Buffalo, and I know there's a long history of issues in Buffalo, segregation and stuff. So I've learned to kind of understand that and observe situations because of that. Because in New York City, I didn't feel the way I felt coming up to Buffalo. Felt different. And I think I felt more empowered to say what I needed to say because New Yorkers think, you know, we're New Yorkers. So, but it's just the idea of categorization that is so beyond me sometimes, and it constrains us. But then I also feel like it empowers me, because at the same time, it's this weird dichotomy, because when people ask me, who are you, what are you? Because they think I'm also, like Lisette, Black and white, Native American, you know, they don't know what I am. And I tell them I'm Puerto Rican, you know, and I just use my country. I don't use my color. I use my country, my country. I'm American, but I'm Puerto Rican. And it's always how I've identified myself.
Thank you. So I want to acknowledge, go ahead, Ms. Stevens.
Martha, can I just jump in here for a minute? Because
Yes,
the color white, whether I'm in Buffalo, New York, in Cuba, in Miami, is good. So I think that that's the norm. That's the norm. How do we change in mindset is very, very challenging. So white supremacy is saying that's where it is. That is what we need to measure to. Help me understand, what is it that we as Latinas, that we had so many shades, can challenge that? What would be the way to challenge and reject that in an impactful way? Because it's just not in America, but of course it's very prevalent here. But it doesn't matter where you go, white is where it is.
And so,
And I say this, let's keep it real. They're afraid. They're 100% afraid. And when I say they, you know, to see, you know, I joke around, like, we're coming, right? We're here. You know, it's not that we're coming, we've been here, right? And so every other group that comes in and, you know, and having to deal with this, but I think there's when you equate color, right? You don't say, oh, the Italians came over here, this came over here. When
Right.
you bring something visceral to people, right?
yes.
You know, internally and externally, it makes it, you know, when Eunice is talking about this white, that everything is pure and Snow White and everything.
Right.
And oh, you know, the cowboy's coming with the black hat and this is whatever. And you're like, you know, how and why do you see me? And I'm saying that specifically as a male. I'm saying that specifically as a Black man. In the challenges that I have to go through and how I deal with, you know, with people of an authority, you know, and the extraness that I have to feel, because you are feeling some type of way about me, but you don't know me, and so it's a very real dynamic, even how my mother grew up, North Carolina on the coast, and her name was Isabella. Everyone thought she was the Puerto Rican, and that's what my father, Oswaldo, was that, even, my girlfriend, I'll tell this story just really quick. She'd come home to New York and she's like, oh, I want to have collard greens and, we're going to eat macaroni and cheese and this and that. Latina sister, she's whatever. And so she comes in my house and, my mother had the collard greens, but she had the panini, she had the big, she was doing whatever. She's like, I was like, well, this is what you do in New York. This is, this is who we are, so it's not defined by your skin color, but how you were raised. And I just wanted to put down, they're afraid. I just wanted to say that.
Thank you for bringing up that idea of the negotiation of body politics and identity based on location and based also on the intersectionality of gender and showing up as a Black or brown man in society, and how that affects the way the world interacts with you and also the ways in which you interact with the world. And Oswaldo, I heard you mention something earlier, and I want to bring this back up again. You were talking about really this idea of this self-love, this self-care, in order for you to not be, and the word I would use is erased, because when people see you only as one thing, you get erased. And so what colorism is saying is, let's erase the brownness, let's erase the Blackness, let's erase anything that serves as a dichotomy or a separation from whiteness, because as Eunice said, whiteness is what equals good. And that's really bringing up this idea of white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we're going to talk, let's go there. Let's talk about white supremacy. Let's talk about why people are scared of anything that works in, that looks opposite of white supremacy. And why isn't everything else normalized? Why do we have to normalize ourselves to the status quo?
I mean, it's real, if we're talking about the relationships that how we have with people in power. And again, you're right, negotiating that, as opposed to if you understood me, if you understood where the person who cut my hair looks like me, my doctor looks like me. When I'm in supermarkets, I'm around with people like me. When I pump my gas, I'm around people like me. So I don't have to negotiate that with people who don't look like me, right? Because you don't understand where I'm at. I'm constantly having to explain that, right? And this burden that we have in terms of constantly feeling like we have to explain that, as opposed to when I look at you, you guys are not explaining nothing to each other. The benefit of the doubt happens, right? When we're talking about Eric Gardner, when we're talking about those folks, when we're talking about, what has gotten us to this point right here, there was no benefit of the doubt, right? And we look at skin color, right? And we look at Black and brown people. And again, you talked about we've had to navigate that, but more specifically, as a Black man, and as a Latino, as somebody who having to re-explain that, and always constantly trying to be the first. We all have this, and you're looking back at that, and even though I'm in a position and I work for the mayor of the second largest city, in the state, feeling and looking at my colleagues why aren't there more people who look like you? Because when I grew up, there were people who looked like me, and so that's real. And it's something some people call it a burden, but it's just some things that, we do because we want to pave the way for the folks who are coming in, that next generation.
I think we also have to acknowledge the fact that colorism, just as racism, is inherently American, and it's really how this country was founded. I mean, if you go back all the way to the days of slavery, it was the lighter skinned slaves that had the quote unquote lesser harsh jobs, right? And the reality is, why don't we see more people of color, darker color, represented in those positions of power and privilege? It's quite frankly because those that are in power now and hold the privilege refuse to share or let it go. I mean, that's just the reality. And so it's really up to us as a community to challenge the system and hold people accountable. But the reality is it's a power struggle, and it's folks that have had that power all this time and are in those positions of privilege are quite frankly just not willing to give it up.
But can I just jump in here a minute? But Giselle, I get it. You say America, but I was raised in Cuba, and I was one of 5 girls, and we all had different texture here. And I remember my 2 older sisters had what is called kinky hair or bad hair. And I know how my mother had to struggle. And we were privileged in terms, we went to a private school. I so just happened had better hair or straighter hair. And I remember my mother struggling to straighten their hair so that they could be accepted a little bit more. So what I'm saying is that this might be not just in the United States, but from a small island in Cuba, white was good. And we had to do everything to fit that category.
Yeah, you see it play out. You see it play out even in the Latino countries. And I think when I mentioned it earlier, when you look at those that are in politics and hold positions of power within the government and those that are on the screen, they're all light skinned. So you're right, it's not just American. It really is a worldwide problem with this issue of whiteness is right.
Yeah, the problem in the US goes all the way back before its founding. And in the Caribbean, remember that colonialism came from different places, and each European country that conquered a place imposed their values and their customs. And places like Dominican Republic were at times French and at times Spanish. But I read a lot about the history of slavery in Martinique, which was a French island, and they went to extreme lengths to keep the white. To the extent that Black people were not allowed to take a name that belonged to a white person. They weren't allowed to wear the same clothes. They weren't allowed to travel or own a business. And as I was reading about this in the late 1700s, early 1800s, I could have been reading about the Jim Crow South. I could have been reading about events happening today in our country. So much of this is historically ingrained in the way we breathe.
Tammy, I have two daughters, and you know, they are in their early 30s. And I remember when they were born, we bought them black dolls, but their hair was straight. It was not kinky. It wasn't curly. And I hate to use the word kinky because kinky to me is so negative. But I remember my older daughter saying, Mom, but her texture is not like mine, but her skin is like mine. So he's saying that straight hair is good.
Well, just take a survey the next time you go to any stores that have a doll section, even today, and see how many, what is the variety of dolls with different skin tones compared to all of the white dolls. And you'll see that there's usually a tiny little section with 1 or 2 dolls that have darker skin.
And they're more expensive usually.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're more expensive.
Sometimes they don't even have real hair. It's just plastic.
But Tammy, sometimes they're more expensive too.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's you know, that's just another issue there. But just to go back to Glisette's point, you know, and the colorism, I think it's rampant. I think in Latin America, almost anywhere you'll find that gradation, you know, that is important. And the lighter you are, the more,
of course,
the better it is. And so I just think it's something that we need to just call out all the time. I mean, that's really what we need to do is just call it out all the time when you see that.
Tammy talked about, you know, when you're going to different islands, and we all admire the different forts, but the forts weren't created, you know, to fight other people. When they got there, they built forts because there were people when they went to the islands that were there, the Niños, the Arab, you know, they were there, right? And so he said, you know what, you stay out, I'm going to stay in. And they did that. You can point to each one of the islands down there, right, and say that too. So I think that's something when we're talking about our, you know, history, is not to be silent about that and to be very real about that and how we look at that, you know. So, and I agree with you, you know, try finding, you know, if it's hard to find and, you know, a Latina Black doll, try looking for a guy, you know, you got all these G.I. Joes, you know, so, you know, I'm just saying.
So I'm hearing a lot of talks of the way in which through the years there have been moments and instances of resistance, but that narrative has not been elevated all the time. And so we're here to elevate the narrative and combat colorism in our communities. So at this time, I'm going to begin to ask the panelists some of the questions that have come up from the audience. And if we go back, I'm going to also invite the audience, if you wrote your question in the chat, to please use the Q&A feature. Please use the Q&A feature. And I'm going to ask you all this question by someone named Michelle. Michelle asks, as a part of a successful group of people, do you feel the stress of colorism and impact in your daily life? Should I answer that, y'all?
Well, we got this thing.
I'm gonna give a real answer. Listen, you guys can go on Instagram, you can search YouTube, you can, I'm gonna give an answer as a darker skinned Black woman. Oh, you're cute for a dark skinned girl, or you have such a pretty smile for a dark skinned girl. So that's how it affects even my personal and professional life. I was honestly on a professional meeting the other day, and the person just kept commenting on my smile and the entire time while we're talking about equity and racial justice. So that really tells you how far we need to go, because you're commenting on things that are part of my phenotype, my features, and you are ignoring the intellectualism or the intellect that I am bringing to the meeting. And that is a problem, because throughout history, we've seen that people who are lighter skin are often considered smarter, or they have more to bring to the table. And yet this continuous need to prove myself as intelligent, to prove myself. Why do I always have to prove myself? I saw someone write in the chat earlier, why do I need to continuously renegotiate who I am to make other people, AKA white people, more comfortable? Mm-hmm. And so throughout my life, I've had to renegotiate my identity in high school, in college, in grad school, at work, I'm still doing it, and it's a challenge. So you wanted a real answer. That's a real answer of how it affects me personally and professionally.
Yeah, I want to jump on that, Martha, because what you said, renegotiate your identity, just hits a real place for me, because, you know, I felt like I've had to do that throughout my life, my personal and professional life. And it's not that I felt, it's weird, because I don't know if I felt forced to do it. I just felt like it just was a better way for me to manage through my life. You know, and it was just better. And again, it really was only when I got older and more confident in me and what I meant to myself, to my children, my identity, when I was secure in that, that's when I was like, I don't need to be, you know, maneuvering and manipulating and negotiating who I am. And yeah, it's, you know, and thank you very much. Yes, I am a smart woman. Thank you. I appreciate that. I've worked hard. Thank you so much. You know? And it's like, you know, it's just interesting the kinds of comments you get out of just ignorance. I'm going to put it in a safe place there and say ignorance and not racist, you know, but it's just an interesting conversations you have. I mean, there are people that I talk to in New York. I mean, I'm not talking about in the middle of in North Dakota, you know, in New York, who don't know Puerto Ricans are US citizens, you know, and things like that really, they impress on me the kind of curriculum, the kind of teaching we really need to do as a country. But I mean, when you don't know, and there are a lot of Puerto Ricans in New York, and you don't know that, you know, that just tells me we got a lot of work to do.
But you know, it is 2020, and it's incredible how so many people are so surprised when a person of color is able to communicate, write, articulate their thoughts. And what to me is incredible is the reaction from white people, Caucasian, who are educated themselves. To me, that troubles me, because what it tells me is that they don't really think that we have the capacity. They don't believe that we have the intellectual capacity to learn. For that matter, is having the officer putting his knee on George Floyd's neck, to me, demonstrated that George Floyd was not human. That is what it's telling me. So when they see us communicating, when they see us successful, when they see us that the sky is, we can reach the sky, they are surprised. And that is how they see us. And that is very troublesome to me, very troublesome. You know what? As you know, I have a daughter who is on television, and when she goes on interviews, they're shocked the way she speaks and her reaction, but I only know the English language. So, you know, so we just have a lot of work to do.
And I think that's reinforced, as I said earlier, when they see us coming, or they see that, and then they coalesce, right, in positions of power. And so they have to check ourselves, or check ours overtly, using it more, you know. And so when we're talking about how to, you know, mitigate a situation or a conflict situation, is never to have a conversation. They're like, wait a second, he's big. He's not the, you know what? My first inclination is a show of force, as opposed to negotiating, right? You know, and so I know we've moved over into this idea of race, but you can't separate the two, right?
Does everybody here speak Spanish? Does everybody here speak Spanish? Because I have heard it among Spanish-speaking people. They see a Black Hispanic speaking well wherever, pero ese negro habla bien. Ese negro habla muy bien. Well, what is that?
That's true.
We do it to ourselves. It isn't just others doing.
Yes, that's what I'm trying to say.
We do it to ourselves as well.
And
one of the things that I have seen is that we find ourselves underrepresented at all of the tables of power because the person that is identified as speaking well and being educated then is asked to participate in every committee, in every board, in every, you know, and they're the representative. There's one or two or three or four, you know, depending on the population, but there's a small percentage of people that are considered fit to represent all of the other people that are Puerto Rican, or that are Dominican, or that are of a particular group.
And so, Dr. Tamara, what you're saying brings us to Elizabeth's question. Elizabeth is asking if we can speak to the fact that Latinx people have economic power, political power, and influence for change due to the fact that in the US, the population has increased from 16% to 18% between 2010 and 2019. So they've accounted for half, or 52%, of all US population growth over that period. And so she goes on to state, we are the country's second largest racial or ethnic group behind white non-Hispanics. So how can Latinx people ensure that their voices are heard rather than marginalized, and not elevating one particular voice as part of the status quo?
I think there's two pieces to that. Number one, I think education. I'm biased in that. I'm a teacher myself, but I do think that education is really the foundation of it all, and making sure that our communities understand the legislative process, understand the lobbying process, understand who are our representatives and how do we have a seat at the table. We really need to engage our young people in social change and action research projects so that they understand that through action and through numbers that we can in fact impact change. The other part of it is that I completely agree with Elizabeth, with Betty, love you. We are a majority. And so part of it is we need to start acting like it. And one of my pet peeves is the use of the word minority, and how many Hispanic and Latinos and African American individuals continue to refer to ourselves and our communities as minorities. And whenever that comes up in the classroom, I look at my students of color and I say, is there anything minor about you? Because I know there is nothing minor about me. And so until we stop referring to ourselves as the minority, we're never going to be able to be the majority and have those folks that are in positions of privilege and power to respect our place as the majority, because we are. So part of it is we need to change our self-reflection, our self narrative, if you will, change the narrative. But then I think education is really what we need to do within our community.
Giselle, I want to jump in there because, as you know, I'm a trustee for the State University of New York, and I totally believe that education, and excellent education is the only equalizer. So I'm very troubled that many and I'm specifically speaking about our Hispanic students, graduate, but they are unable to perform. Okay, so I think that we need to, it is incumbent upon us to make sure that our Latino students graduate with the excellent skills that they need to be able to compete.
And we need to give them those tools, and we need to make sure our educators understand the community that they're teaching in and are willing to put in that extra effort. I mean, that it's extra effort, you know, to work with a community that's unlike your own. And so they have to be willing to do that. We also have to be willing as our own people to look at our own histories and understand our own histories, because we can be educated starting now forward, but we have a lot of stuff starting now back that we are not aware of. Some horrible things and some amazing things that we are not aware of. And so we need to make sure that we are educated for the future, but understand our past and celebrate, I like to just celebrate our connections to our indigenous connections, our African connections, and understand that, you know, we were colonized by Europeans, but, you know, there's something to be said about that, and we are who we are because of that too. And
yeah,
so,
but Michelle, I agree with
but what I'm just saying is, I agree with you. I mean, I'm an educator, I understand that, but there's a part that we're responsible for, and that is understanding our own histories. And honestly, there's a lot of craziness between our own people, Cubans, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans. I mean, we have our own crazy issues that we need to get over if we're gonna come together, you know, and start really making some sort of concerted effort to, you know, to put ourselves ahead of this game. But
But I think that we need to demand excellence, and through excellence, we will bring about change. I think that to accept mediocrity from whoever it comes from, we need to reject that, because that in a very subtle way is keeping us back.
Thank you, Eunice. I'm going to jump to Oswaldo right now. I think he's been trying to,
Yeah, no. So this is where, Martha, I talk about self-love, right? And how I introduced that a little earlier about knowing and loving on ourselves and understanding that. Glisette talked about, she brought in how our youth. I say even goes younger than that. You know, when you're kids, you know, you don't see color. You're sitting next to somebody, whatever. And how are we role models to them, right? How do we do that? You know, I work in the public service, and I hear this word, oh, we have to empower. We have to empower. We have to do this, and we have to work with that. And I say, you know what? Empower. We have to equip. We have to equip people. And so we keep on saying this word empower, right? Give the people the tools and equip them, you know. And so we're not looking at each other where, you know what, I'm building an industry because I'm helping people. No, I want to build wealth. We talked about economic power within the Latino community. We have to realize that, right? We have to understand that. I'm serious when I say that my doctor looks like me because I choose that, right? And I'm serious when I say that I'm going to go to this gas station because the person in that gas station, when I need something and I don't have change, he says, Oswaldo, got it. See me later. You know what? I got a haircut today from a person who looked like me, and I didn't have money because I don't walk around with money. I got cards, you know, whatever. He said, don't worry about it, right? Because if you choose to empower folks, and when we're talking about collective putting our monies together, and not even our money, but our time and our talent, having conversations like this and learning something from it and applying that, we become a better people. We talk about that, you know, when we're talking about self-love, it's easy for me. My mother said it's easy to love you because I know you, right? And if I don't know you, it's harder for that. But if I know you and I take that time to do that, and I think we have to just think about how we do that. And I think Michelle is right. And it starts with us because we're the first people to say, we Puerto Rico, you're Dominican, you're this, you're that, or whatever, you know, and we separate ourselves. And it's before somebody else chooses to do that to us too. And I bring up that, you know, I bring up, you know, I was in a meeting, up here in Buffalo, and I was with some big wigs and, you know, telling people, they were talking about folks, and they said, oh, she's from the projects. And they mentioned Louisa, you know, and I kept on saying, whoa, what is that about? Yeah. You know, and it wasn't nobody else. It was us, and I'm going to add this, there's a generational aspect to this. And if we're going to be honest, there's definitely a generational aspect to it. Because I think sometimes when we say, oh, la negrita, I think we call those terms of endearment, right? We say, oh, you know, that's my, no, that's been reinforced, so we need to, that self-love, and need to look at that ourselves.
So thank you for bringing that up. What I'm hearing is a lot of talk about how do we break away from the generational stereotyping and stigmas that have been passed down, which is a question quite a few people in the audience have been asking. How do we connect intergenerationally and have those conversations? I'd like to say that this space is one of those places where you can connect intergenerationally and have those conversations. It's by connecting with the Hispanic Heritage Council of Western New York. It's by connecting with people like Michelle, Eunice, Oswaldo, Glisette, and Dr. Tamara. This is the space where we do the work for equity and access. And so if you are here, you're already engaging in the conversation. And for people who say that the conversation is not work, I'd like to remind you of the words of Bell Hooks. The conversation is the work. If you're not talking about it, you're not changing it. And so I want to say that this is part of the work. And for those of you who are asking, what privileges has this group experienced? And we're talking about what we've experienced and what we've not experienced. And I hear a lot of people right now are asking, what about those who are in positions of authorities as members of the Latinx community? Are they going to continue to give way to colorism? Well, if it's not challenged, if you don't do things like Michelle did, where she refused to fill out a form, if you don't go in and ask people at school, like Dr. Colon did, and say, why is this going on with our children? If you are not doing that work on an individual basis, then it will have no power collectively. And so that's what I think I'm hearing from this panel here, is it takes the individual, but it also takes the collective. And so when you're asking, how do teachers respond to colorism in schools? Oswaldo held up the brown paper bag. I had my students do that in school. They came to me and demonstrated that brown paper bag. And what that is an example of is what doctors Mammy and Kenneth Clark did in the 1950s with Brown versus Board, and proved that segregation was harmful, and when children literally experienced dissonance based on colorism. That wasn't just about racism, it was about also colorism. And so we saw the intersection of those two meeting here. So it is, as Michelle, I'm gonna call her Dr. Michelle because she is getting her PhD. So I'm just gonna call those things that are not yet as though they were. So I'm gonna call it, Dr. Michelle said, you need to really get out there and teach the kids. Dr. Colon said, you need to get out there and teach the kids. Dr. Tamara, Eunice, Oswaldo have said, you need to get out there and teach the kids. If you see it happening in your classroom, there is no excuse for you to not step in and interrupt that narrative and interrupt that conversation. And if a teacher is doing it to a student, I see an anonymous attendee said, we had a student from Cuba being constantly questioned by teachers. As an adult, it is your role to step in, because a 12-year-old does not necessarily have the language to say that that is harassment and you are making me uncomfortable, that is colorism, that is racism. Now you are giving that child the tools that Oswaldo has just spoken about. So we're going to keep answering your questions. I know it's getting late, so we will pause once Dr. Tamara tells us to pause. But we're going to continue, and I'm going to just continue to open it up to the panelists to look at the questions in the chat and to continue answering.
I do want to be sure that we get to the resources so folks know that we have made a collection of resources for your reading pleasure and continued discussion and education. It really is important that in addition to those individual daily acts that we perform, that we get to work towards equitable policies and practices as well on a larger scale. And I go back to someone you quoted earlier, Ibram Kendi, who talks about color anti-racism. And it's a powerful collection of anti-racist policies that lead to equity between light people and dark people, supported by anti-racist ideas about light and dark people. And I love the simplicity of Kendi's explanation. You're either an anti-racist or you're supporting racist policies. So we have to be working towards equitable policies all the time, and not just at the micro level, but at the macro level as well.
Thank you so much for bringing him up, because I actually have his book right next to me. I was like, I was going to close with a quote from Kendi's work. We really need to take a photo at the end of us just holding up this work. So that is a resource, beautiful people. And it is 7:19, but we do want to still answer a couple of more questions. And that is the resource page. So if you would type in, and you will understand if you just type in the tinyurl.com HHC Colorism, it is case sensitive when it's a tiny URL. It should take you to a page to make your own copy. So you get your own copy of the resources. And so while you're looking at that, an anonymous attendee, we're going back to this idea of colorism and demanding excellence from students, is saying, I worry many instructors consider excellence to mean a European white standard, not allowing space for stigmatized dialects spoken in informal contexts by non-white populations. So would one of the panelists like to address that?
I think if I'm just going to chime in. I completely agree with anonymous attendee, is that is an issue, is what is the standard, right? We see that play out when we're talking about our language learners and what is standard English that we're comparing and holding these students to. And I think that going back and tying this answer to some of the other questions that I'm seeing about how do we do this as educators? What are the tools? And I'd like to encourage you to kind of change your thinking and not focus on trying to get your hands on a hard copy tool, so to speak, but really it's about the perspectives and changing perspectives and looking at our students using asset-based pedagogies, right? And so if you take a look at Taro Yoso's framework, for example, of cultural community wealth, and having those conversations within the classroom and encouraging your students to understand that there are different forms of capital that they bring to the classroom: linguistic capital, aspirational capital, resistance capital, and so on. And when we start having those conversations, there really is no one standard, right? Because all of our students come to us with different forms of capital that we then bring into the curriculum. And so I agree, we have to be careful that we don't penalize our students because they don't meet this golden standard. Excellence, absolutely, I 100% agree with Eunice. We have to demand excellence, but we want to make sure that by doing so, our students don't have to renounce their identities.
I don't know what happened here, but I don't see myself. So Tommy, I don't know. Can you hear me? Can
Yes.
you hear me?
Hear
We
you?
hear you.
We
So-
see you.
so-
We hear you.
Yeah, we can
So,
see.
Can you hear me, Tammy?
Yes.
Yes.
And we could see.
Okay, so I'm a kicker for excellence, but I'm also very passionate that every child is unique and every child brings uniqueness to the classroom. And I do not want to minimize that. What I want to stress here is that we live in a very competitive world, and there are certain things that in order for us to succeed, we have to be excellent. We have to have certain basic skills. And in a way, sometimes, and I experience this when I work on the Buffalo Public School, many teachers, I shouldn't say many, I take that back, some teachers just did not believe in the potential of a student. Okay, so average or below average is okay when that child can be excellent. So I think that is very, very, very important, and we have to have the courage really to push our students to be the best they can be. Saying that, I'm not saying that we should minimize their uniqueness in their culture, in their dialects. But in order to be competitive, we need that and more.
Yeah, but yes, 100%. But we also need to teach our teachers, which goes to another whole different conversation, which I think is, again, going back to how can teachers, I mean, most of our teachers in the Buffalo Public Schools are white, a white female, right? And so how do we get to train and teach? And the district is doing that now, but it's this idea of training and teaching teachers, because if the teachers have limited understanding or expectations for whatever reason, whether they were taught that in college or they've lived an experience or whatever it is, it's the teachers need those tools. And once, it's like all these layered pieces that they have to fit together, because none of it's going to work if it doesn't.
I agree, and it's also an issue of access and opportunity, and not just in the education system, because sometimes we tend to put everything on the education system. Education is critical, but we can't have a good education if there are health disparities, housing insecurity, food insecurity, all of the things that together conspire to make it very difficult for children to succeed or to reach those high levels of achievement. So we have to address systems and realize that, the schools don't operate in a vacuum. They're like a microcosm of the larger community. And, being such a segregated city and one of the poorest in the country, and there's all kinds of data and reports to illustrate that. We need to make sure that our students from the beginning, from before birth, have all that they need to have successful lives.
Tammy, I'm glad you said that, because and I agree. Education is the crux of how we do this change. I remember my mother, who was a nurse's aide, and I was the first person in my family to go to college. Every day, did you go to class? Did you do this? Did you do that? And it was my pathway to move out of the projects to go to a university, and to get that. And so I think, I can remember who my 5th grade teacher was. I can remember who my 6th grade teacher was because of the impression. But then there's some grades that I don't know where, so I have that as well. But I also want to say these other systems that play a role, when we're talking about employment, when we look at folks, how we sometimes marginalize, these communities. You talked about redlining and all of these things, and how that affects a community. Even how we just say that Latinos only live in one part of Buffalo, right? When I can look at the data that's saying that we're moving in other parts, but we only focus on, it's like this is where they're at. And mostly when we're saying we're focusing on that, we're focused on the folks who probably don't have, right? So again, let me go ahead and empower them and not equipping. I talked about something definitely within the educational system is really about empowerment, and talking about families. But, if we want to keep it real, we need to keep it real with the people who look like us and making sure that they understand that. Because we talk about economic wealth. We can't talk about any of that if they have no vision of thinking, the power of how they use their money, or the power of how they're collectively saying that you're not representing me correctly. And this is how I think you should represent me, in that respect.
Thank you so much for that. I really want to point out what Dr. Tamara said regarding making sure that
Sorry.
I really want to acknowledge what Dr. Tamara said about making sure that the fundamental needs are first met. And as someone wrote in the chat, Maslow before blooming. You can't do the blooming or do instructional leadership or teaching or even work with our students if we're not taking care of their biological or physical needs. And I also do want to acknowledge what Glisette said regarding Yoso's work. And in 2015, I believe she wrote a piece, it was a piece about cultural deficit and acknowledging that, sorry, I'm gonna ask if some folks can mute. And she wrote in that piece about deficit and acknowledging our students' cultural capital. And in light of colorism, we've talked a lot about lightness as capital. So how can every other part of a student be their capital? And so that's really what we're here to acknowledge. So I'm really grateful that we're also talking about some practical pedagogical media and policy initiatives that we can adopt to better foment knowledge of the history, as Adrienne Rodriguez asked. So I think that goes back to what Oswaldo was saying earlier about the self-love and self-care. What is your pedagogy rooted in as a teacher? What is your pedagogy rooted in as someone who's working within the Latinx community? It's very important to be able to know what you believe and why you believe it. And so teachers need to be trained in that as much as city officials. Why do you enact certain policies and behaviors? Why is it benefiting you? Who is it benefiting? And how can you bring change if it's not benefiting anyone in your community? And so that would allow us to address the question that several people who are part of the audience have been asking: what about those who are simply promoting Latinx people who are lighter skin and have a certain body type? That's what's going to stop it. If you directly confront and challenge some of these limiting beliefs, and they are limiting because they're not allowing you to acknowledge the humanity of another if you are rating them based on a scope of physical features. So that's the work we're doing here. Dr. Tamara, I'm going to turn everything over to you.
Yes, it is 7:30, so I do want to, acknowledge that our time is done, and we thank everyone for being here today, for asking wonderful questions. We know that this is we're just scratching the surface just a little bit today by getting this conversation started, and it's something that we need to continue. I want to thank all of our panelists: Eunice Lewin, Dr. Glisette Colon, Oswaldo Mestre, and Michelle Agosto, and our wonderful moderator, Martha St. John. All of you have contributed immensely to this conversation, and we appreciate your participation, your wisdom, and all of the wonderful participants as well. If you enjoyed today's show, I want you to please go and show your appreciation by visiting www.hispanicheritagewny.org and showing your appreciation, if you can, with any little contribution to help support this and other programs of the Hispanic Heritage Council. We hope to continue this dialogue in the future, and we wish you all a wonderful evening. Remember to visit the resources page as well, and we did record the event, and we'll be posting it on our Facebook page.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank
All right,
you
that
so
New York,
much.
that Brooklyn. All right, I see you. All right. Niños.
Nice job, Tammy. Thank you, Martha.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great job, ladies.
Dr.
job.
Tammy, are you going to pause the,
Yes. How do I do that?
you hit stop recording at the top.
Please stop recording.
Yeah.
Okay.